Welcome to World History, Unit 1, Page 1. We are going to dive back into the River Valley Civilization, something you should have known in 8th grade, or something you should have been taught in 8th grade. So, before we get into that, in order to understand much of what is discussed in this class, we must be familiar with the following common social science terms. You need to know what political means, you need to know what society means, you need to know what cultural means, and you need to know what economic means. Let's start with political. Refers to who is running the society and controls the power. Most of the time, it's going to be the government or the elite. Society, what does it mean? It's the economic status being the key word, and classes such as rich, soldiers, slaves, etc., as well as gender roles. Cultural, it refers to characteristics of the local people, things like religion, things like language, art. These are all part of the cultural. Economic means how they trade, bought, or sold goods and services. That's what economics means. So, let's get into this now that you're familiarized with those terms. Right. During the River Valley Civilization era, you had the emergence of the state system. So following the permanent and pastoral societies of the Neolithic era, human population grew exponentially and made the organization and functions of society much more difficult. Kinship was no longer a feasible form of social organization, as there was now a need to coordinate and exercise authority over cities with populations in the thousands, because now the population was booming, so you had to rule over way more people. You need a more sophisticated system. The most common form of social hierarchy quickly became a patriarchal monarchy. Historians believe this was most likely due to physically intense form of labor and combat requirements. Along with monarchs, their advisors, officials, and priests generally occupied the most prominent and powerful societal positions. These monarchs and their officials were in charge of food and resource, surpluses, defensive walls, and soldiers, infrastructure, and domestic law, both its creation and enforcement. Below the ruling class often sat those individuals or family that were more successfully economically or agriculturally elites. Then the productive labor force, common farmers and artisans, those deemed unproductive or unworthy, like the lower class, and finally those owned by others, such as the slaves. How would it look like? For example, in Egypt, over here, one of these early civilizations, who do you have at the top? The pharaoh, who is the king of Egypt. Who do you have beneath the pharaoh? Well, you had the senior officials, you had the high priest, you had the nobles, the people who counsel the pharaoh. Then you have people who can read and write, the scribes. This will be lower than the advisors or the senior officials. Then at the bottom, beneath them, you had the skilled artisans and craft people. And then beneath them, you had the peasant farmers and workers, especially the ones with small farms. If you have a big farm, you'll probably be here, right beneath the pharaoh. And finally, you had the servants and the slaves at the very bottom of this pyramid. And this is how a societal pyramid will look almost anywhere you go. This is exactly how it looked like. So now that you know about the emergence of the state system, let's talk about the civilizations. These civilizations were formed in river valleys. So the most successful early state systems often thrived due to the locations at or around fertile river valleys. And why is it key? This word right here, fertility. You needed to be next to a land that could produce goods and services, especially food, arable soil, and consistent source of water so people can drink and people can survive and people can live for longer periods of time. These were known as the river valley civilizations. These societies grew larger and more complex than the neighboring communities, often growing to conquer or control surrounding settlements through force or diplomacy. Now, where do you have these civilizations? If you look at the map over here, I'm also going to draw it here. Mesopotamia, a region we're familiar with. Around here, you have the early River Valley civilization, obviously you can never forget about Egypt. Egypt over here, around the Indus River. And finally, you have the Yellow River, or China. That will look something along these lines. So, over here you have the Yellow River. Over here, I'm just gonna write it bigger over here. You have Mesopotamia. Sorry, not Mesopotamia, Indus. Now here you do have Mesopotamia. And finally, Egypt. These are the River Valley civilizations that you need to know. So following their success, the practices, structure, and cultural successful civilizations began to absorb or synchronize with those that were less successful, initiating a sort of evolutionary survival mechanism for societies and their cultural histories, things like language, social structure, religion, and fashion, just to name a few. As such, the practices, structure, and culture of those who survive continue historically and can be seen archaeologically or even in the language, practices, structure, or cultures of present-day society. So now, let's get to the growth of societal complexity. Early state systems were dominated by men who acted as the rulers, soldiers, scholars, and heads of the household, and nearly every world civilization. As certain individuals acquired political or military strength, social disparity began as these individuals became the elites of societies possessing more land or more power than others. Local culture was defined by monuments. Structures were built by laborers and slaves. Examples include the pyramids in Egypt and the ziggurats in Mesopotamia, which will look something like this. These are the ziggurats, and the pyramids, we all know how they look like. Now, with a surplus of goods and the beginning of real trade, early writing forms developed in the 4th millennium BC in the Mesopotamian region. Examples include the cuneiform in the Sumerian Empire, hieroglyphics in Egypt, and the alphabet by the Phoenicians. So, who developed what? In Sumeria, which is this where the Sumerian Empire was. They developed cuneiform. In Egypt, they developed hieroglyphics, and that's how they communicated with each other. And the Phoenicians, which would dominate the Greek world around here, they created the alphabet. Additionally, written laws was developed to provide consistent laws, despite these laws favoring elites. For example, in Mesopotamia, you have the Code of Hammurabi. You have the Code of Hammurabi, which was developed in 1754 BC in the Mesopotamia area. You also have the Code of Ur-Mammu in 2100 BC, also developed in Mesopotamia. And now, these structures. People are coming out of their caves. People are leaving their family communal forms, and now they're developing cities. And this is an example of a sketch of a city, how it would look like back in those days. You had the wall to protect them from invaders. You had the fertile land around you. And finally, you go inside and you have all the tradesmen and all the craftsmen in there. Last thing we're going to talk about is divine justification of power. To justify their positions through means other than force or success, a common technique to maintain their power was claiming connection to the divine, as a monarch justified their power through divinity. Either as stewards of the gods or as deities themselves, monarchs, their officials, and priests develop and tie divinity and theology to the monarchical seat of power. In Egypt, pharaohs lived as gods on earth, instilling fear and respect among subjects. In Mesopotamia, the monarchs claimed power as acting stewards, messengers sanctioned by the gods to carry out their bidding. In China, rulers were legitimized by the mandate of heaven, an abstract concept in which the Chinese monarch claimed direct divine approval from the heavens. So you have over here the mandate of heaven. This meant that if they rule benevolently and maintain social harmony, the Chinese will experience good fortune and stability. If a ruler rules selfishly and fails to maintain social harmony, shall experience famine, disaster, or rebellion. Regardless of specific region or practice, the concept was the same. The monarchs who were in power because they were linked with the gods themselves. That was the idea, and that's how they maintained power.